The Rainbow Magic Fairy series was originally published in the United Kingdom. In this video, I'm going to talk about Book 13, Storm the Lightning Fairy. I'm listing all the various changes I noticed when the book was republished in the United States. Let's start with the changes made to the area before the book begins. On the map, Sweet Factory becomes Candy Factory, the High Street becomes High Street, Cottage becomes House. In the poem, Doodle becomes the Rooster. Chapter 1. For a week's holiday becomes for a week, and it's moved to the end of the sentence. At the Tate's house in Weatherbury becomes in Weatherbury. The girls had had so many adventures becomes the girls had gone on so many adventures. Difficult becomes hard. Now is added to the start of the second paragraph of the book. Keen to get outside becomes excited to be outside. Now the rain had stopped is removed. Pouring down becomes pouring rain. The sun was shining becomes the sun was shining again. Though, won't you becomes please. They set off becomes they left. Quite breezy becomes awfully breezy. Such fun becomes so much fun. Having you to stay becomes having you visit. She agreed firmly becomes she agreed. Naughty goblins becomes goblins. Cockerel becomes rooster. And taken one each into the human world is removed. The feathers were used by the weather fairies becomes the weather fairies used the feathers. The goblins were becomes now that the goblins had them, they. To get becomes get. Iron weather vane becomes weather vane. Found him becomes found it. After he'd chased the goblins into the human world is removed. Mr. Tate had brought becomes he brought. Him becomes it. Him becomes it. The old barn becomes their old barn. Doodle's got becomes Doodle has. But I do hope becomes I hope. Gates becomes gate. There is a pattering sound and is removed. In dismay is removed. The sky was darkening becomes the sky was getting darker. Rain was falling more and more heavily becomes rain was coming down harder and harder. Quick becomes run quick. Raindrops pelted them from all sides becomes raindrops poured down from above. She could becomes it was raining so hard that she could. Through the sudden downpour is removed. She yelled becomes she cried. Find some shelter becomes find some place out of the rain. And pulling her along is removed. Soaked through becomes soaked. Large becomes big. Branches gave good cover becomes branches were perfect for keeping away the rain. Shivered Rachel becomes said Rachel, shivering and. But just becomes just. Deafening rumble of thunder becomes loud clap of thunder. An almighty flash becomes a bright flash. Was lit up becomes lit up. Lit up by becomes lit up with. Blast of lightning becomes a bolt of lightning. Alarm becomes shock. A lightning bolt becomes the lightning bolt. Straight into becomes right into. The chestnut becomes the chestnut tree. Away from here quickly becomes away from here. Under the trees becomes under a tree. In a thunderstorm becomes during a thunderstorm. Staring at becomes staring up at. The branch becomes that branch. And so it was becomes and it was. Shining a bright is removed. Glowing against the darkness of the day becomes glowing through the dark storm. Were flickering becomes flickered. The bark of the branch becomes the branch. The way is removed. Exclaimed in delight becomes exclaimed. Gazed becomes looked. The sentence starting with both girls is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Before becomes then. Fading becomes faded. It's magical, all right, becomes it's magical. She laughed becomes she said, laughing. Chapter 2. The two girls becomes Rachel and Kirsty. Charged becomes ran. The rain was still beating down becomes the rain was still pouring down. Plastering their hair becomes sticking their hair. Dark and wet becomes dark and wet out. Rather than becomes instead of. Run becomes running. Kirsty pointed ahead becomes Kirsty had another idea. Let's shelter becomes let's go. She cried becomes she cried pointing ahead. As she followed becomes and followed. Weatherbury Museum, she read on a small blue sign, becomes a small blue sign out front read Weatherbury Museum. Kirsty pulled the double doors open, becomes Kirsty yanked open the double doors. Inside becomes inside the museum. Shook her sodden hair becomes shook her hair. Back from her face becomes out of her face. Phew becomes wow. She whistled becomes she said. Was looking becomes looked. It must be the goblin with the lightning feather who's behind this, becomes the goblin with the lightning feather must be behind this. He has to be close by becomes he's nearby. She was interrupted becomes Rachel was interrupted. Some dinosaur bones were found becomes they found some dinosaur bones. Enormous becomes huge. Moves becomes moves every few minutes. Doors that led becomes doors and led. A group of people were becomes a group of people was. Kirsty pointed becomes Kirsty pointed past them. Broad becomes wide. Clearly is removed. To represent becomes to look like. She explained becomes Rachel explained. She said impressed becomes she said pressing. Peculiar looking is removed. Brilliant becomes amazing. Button here becomes button. Hissed becomes whispered. And a puzzled voice becomes sounding confused. My holiday becomes vacation. Somebody's becomes somebody. The group becomes the tour group. She said becomes the guide said. It's just through here becomes it's this way. Look at becomes check out. Stood on tiptoes becomes stood on their tiptoes. They becomes the girls. Could just about see becomes could see. Couldn't quite make out what it was becomes couldn't tell what it was from so far away. The sentence starting with as the group is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. At the windows becomes through the windows. A stream of dancing is removed. Power cut becomes power outage. Said in dismay becomes said, sighing. Torches becomes flashlights. In a cupboard is removed. Through here becomes over here. Display case becomes fairy display case. There inside becomes inside. Real fairy becomes real live fairy. Chapter 3, catch becomes hook. In relief is removed. I'm really glad becomes I'm so glad. Start becomes beginning. The sentence starting with Rachel and Kirsty had met is split into two sentences at the word when, which is removed. Had magically summoned the girls becomes had brought the girls to fairyland. So now they recognize the fairy right away is added after ask for their help. White gold hair becomes blonde hair. Striking becomes bright. Trouser suit becomes outfit. Lightning strike becomes lightning bolt. Out from becomes out of. Shut me in becomes trap me in there. Crossly becomes annoyed. He's somewhere becomes he's still somewhere. He's made becomes he's been making. Please say you'll help me becomes please help me. Get the feather becomes get my feather. Back becomes back from him. The sentence starting with we were under is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. A branch becomes one of the branches. Was cracked becomes broke. Soothe her becomes make her feel better. Shining and is removed. I've got to becomes I have to. Mean old goblin becomes mean goblin. And peered is removed. Into becomes in. Gloomy is removed. Crashed becomes rumbled. Outside is removed. Found becomes realized. Heart was beating wildly becomes heart was pounding. It becomes the noise they heard. And not becomes not. They almost reached the girls' shoulders becomes they were almost as tall as the girls' shoulders. As well as making the goblin stronger is removed. It meant that it was becomes that made it. From them becomes back from them. Held their breath becomes all held their breath. It was the goblin becomes through the darkness they could see that it was the goblin. To Kirsty's dismay is removed. Goblin lit becomes goblin soon lit. Gleefully is removed. The sentence starting with he was waving is split into two sentences at the word crackling. Crackling and fizzing and becomes they crackled and fizzled. I can hardly bear to watch becomes I can't watch. That fool becomes he. Ducking down becomes ducking. We've got to becomes we have to. He does any damage becomes he hurts someone. So loudly becomes so loudly that. Was going to becomes would. Oh ho becomes oh. Toward them becomes right at them. Missing them becomes only missing them. Centimeters becomes inches. Rose and coils becomes rose, and the girls watch them anxiously is removed. Was certainly powerful becomes was powerful. What shall we do becomes what do we do now? Have you got becomes do you have. He's becomes the goblin is. Frowning anxiously becomes frowning, and quickly becomes fast. Peep becomes peak. Closer towards them becomes closer to them. He gloated becomes he yelled. Straight towards becomes right at. Chapter 4. Leapt becomes ducked. Singed becomes burned. Hem of her coat becomes edge of her coat. Up becomes up into the air. So much becomes so much that. Hardly becomes barely. One each becomes one locket each. She finally becomes Kirsty finally. Flip the lid open becomes flipped open the lid. The sentence starting with seconds later is split into two sentences at the word sensation, which is removed. At once is removed. Pirouetted becomes spun. Kirsty becomes just then Kirsty. Kirsty gasps as she saw it becomes Kirsty spotted it. She pointed it out to her friend becomes she pointed it out. Dived for cover becomes ducked for cover. Locket becomes locket for her friend. Came lumbering over becomes ran over. He was so close now that he was almost next to Rachel becomes closer and closer. Dodging neatly becomes dodging, and running away is removed. Magic her into a fairy becomes sprinkle fairy dust onto her. Move any closer becomes get any closer. Their friend becomes Rachel. Wailed becomes yelled. Running away becomes run. Doors crashed becomes doors crashed open. Rachel charged becomes Rachel sprinted. Flew helplessly behind becomes flew behind her. Not sure what to do. This room becomes the room. Kirsty realized is removed. Braved the weather is removed. Headed for home becomes headed for home when the power went out. Was chasing becomes chased. Ant house becomes box. Containing becomes full of. Shook becomes waved. From their work becomes inside. Brilliantly becomes a great job. To outrun the goblin becomes escaping the goblin. Rescue her friend becomes help. Chapter 5. Try and surprise becomes try to surprise. From Rachel's face is removed. Her friend becomes Rachel. Towards becomes toward. At once becomes right away. Long red ears becomes long ears. Angrily is removed. Cooey becomes yoo-hoo. Cheekily is removed. Straight at becomes right at. Cheeky becomes silly. At once is removed. Went shooting becomes zoomed. Towards becomes toward. Practically becomes almost. Scorching is removed. Brave is removed. The sentence starting with but Kirsty is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Out of its way becomes out of the way. Clumsily is removed. His own feet becomes his own big feet. Beneath becomes under. As he did so is removed. Towards becomes toward. Precious is removed. Well is removed. Triumphantly is removed. Try and reach becomes try to reach. Water tray becomes water below. Eyes widened in the light becomes eyes widened. Went the dinosaur, opening its jaw, is removed. It becomes the dinosaur. Chapter 6. Raged becomes cried. The goblin's scream of fear is changed to italics, making it all the more terrifying. On the next page, the words in all caps are changed to italics, which arguably makes them less frightening. Took no notice of becomes didn't listen to. Obediently becomes just. Hammering becomes pounding. Immediately is removed. Started up becomes started. The sentence starting with it glittered is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. A bright lightning white becomes a bright white. Back to being a girl becomes back to being a regular-sized girl. Once more becomes again. She went straight over becomes she ran. All right becomes okay. That got becomes that was. A bit scary becomes scary. Didn't it becomes wasn't it. We managed it becomes everything turned out fine. Brilliant idea becomes great idea. We've got becomes we have. Flew over becomes flew over to the girls. Locket becomes locket in her hands. Here you are becomes here you go. And I think becomes I think. The sentence starting with it sounds like is split into two sentences at the word and, which is removed. Climb out becomes climb out of the dinosaur. Scrabbling becomes scratching. The friends becomes the three friends. Nearly becomes almost. Blasted becomes zapped. The girls in Storm rushed out of the museum is removed. The bad weather had passed is removed. Glisten becomes sparkle. I'd forgotten becomes I forgot that. It had been singed becomes it got burned. Coat hem becomes coat. Blackened becomes black. Frazzled becomes fizzled. Mums becomes moms. Go mad becomes be upset. Was meant to becomes was supposed to. Until autumn becomes through the new school year. Stroked her magic wand becomes waved her magic wand. Glimmered becomes fell. She gasped becomes Rachel gasped. Mum becomes mom. Pleased becomes happy. On the old barn becomes on top of the old barn. Were anxious becomes couldn't wait. Slotted becomes put. Towards becomes toward. As fast as he had come to life becomes just as quickly. His feathers becomes Doodle's feathers. Once more becomes again. One another becomes each other. In alarm is removed. Storm looked worried too becomes Storm looked worried. The sentence starting with but we will is split into two sentences at the word don't. We will becomes we'll. A moment becomes a minute. Nearly becomes almost. Solemnly is removed. In the preview of the next book of the series, have got becomes have all tracked down. Back is removed. Must help Haley the Rain Fairy becomes only have Haley the Rain Fairy left to help. I'm awake becomes okay, I'm awake. Said becomes mumbled. That's strange, she thought. Becomes but strangely. Isn't becomes wasn't. Came again becomes rang through the air again. It hadn't becomes the sound hadn't. Hadn't been becomes hadn't been coming from. The sound was coming becomes it was coming. Outside becomes outside instead. Peeped becomes peaked. Right up to becomes rising right up to. Watched with delight becomes watched. But then she frowned is removed. Raining really hard becomes raining really hard all night. Garden becomes yard. Lawn becomes grass. Underwater becomes under the water. Beyond becomes out past. The lane becomes the street. Spare bed becomes extra bed. A week of the summer holidays becomes a week during her summer vacation. The whole of becomes everything in. Weatherbury Village becomes Weatherbury. And eagerly becomes eagerly. Out of the window becomes out the window. Garden becomes front yard. Lane becomes street. Fairy weather magic becomes weather fairy magic. The sentence starting with they had met is split into two sentences at the word where, which becomes there. They had met becomes the two girls had met. On holiday becomes during vacation. Nasty spell becomes spell. More mischief becomes more trouble. This time with the weather fairies is removed. The preview in the American edition continues for 5 paragraphs past the point where the preview in the British edition stops. And that's everything. This is about 378 changes for a 69-page book, are 5.5 changes per page. That beats the previous record for most changes made to a single Rainbow Magic book, which was held by Pearl the Cloud Fairy. That had only 4 changes per page. 5.5 changes per page is certainly a lot more.